name is Caitlin Krause. I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Engineering. It is my pleasure to introduce you and welcome you to our event this evening. We are so thrilled to have such a great collaboration between College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the School of Engineering, and as well as the Law School here in attendance today. Before we kick off the program, I wanted to just go through a couple very quick housekeeping items so that you guys are aware. Please feel free to get out if you need to while we're doing our presentation. The bathrooms are just out this way past the registration if anyone is looking. The bar is still open, so please feel free to go ahead and help yourself should you need to throughout the program. Our program this evening is going to run about 45 minutes to an hour of conversation, and then we are going to open the floor for Q&A. So if you could just save your questions until the end. My colleagues and I will be here to go ahead and bring a mic over to you so that the entire room can hear what it is that you have to ask. So just go ahead and throw a hand up when we get that, and we'll come and find you. Finally, this event is going to be recorded. So if there's anything that you missed this evening, or if you'd like to go ahead and share this with a colleague or a friend who's unable to join us, you can do so with our UConn Alumni YouTube channel, and that will be sent to you in our post-event wrap-up email. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and open our program. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Kazim Kazarubian, the Dean and Professor of Mechanical Engineering for the UConn School of Engineering. Dean Kazarubian was appointed in 2012, and in his tenure has demonstrated an unwavering commitment to student success and to the betterment of society, which has inspired innovations in curriculum, interdisciplinary programs, experiential learning opportunities, and faculty development. So Kazim, thank you so much for joining us and saying 2 minutes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Caitlin. Let me start by thanking Caitlin Krause and all of her colleagues who have worked hard to bring us together tonight. On the behalf of my fellow deans, Ebony Nelson, Dean of Law School, and Julie Wade, Dean of College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, it is a pleasure to welcome you here. Welcome the distinguished speakers that we have on the panel. It is an amazing subject, and I look forward to the conversations. I have to tell you a little bit about my day today. I started my morning addressing a workshop, and I saw one of the colleagues who attended that workshop as well, on sustainable energies in ITB in Astor's campus. And then immediately after that, I went and joined students at the summit, Provost Summit and Student Success. I spent a few hours there, and then I drove here to be with you to have a conversation about artificial intelligence. And these 3 things, the student success, and then 2 of our strategic pillars of the School of Engineering, something that we are passionate about and we are invested in. But to focus on artificial intelligence, you have heard the cliche of it is changing our lives, and it is changing our lives. It is changing everything. It is changing the way that we work, the way that we drive, the way that we think, the way that we talk, the way that we write. It's changing everything. But there's also a negative side to that. I had an opportunity to talk to a number of graduating students, engineers, who actually had an intrinsic fear of what is it going to do to their jobs. And I shared with them that I graduated with my undergrad degree in 1980, in 1981. And that was when robotics was really, really getting hot. And then I did my master's and PhD. So those were the years that I was living in the fear of all the jobs are going to be taken away. And there is no one that is actually going to find a job in the industry that I always wanted to do. And that's not the case. Actually, we need more engineers than in this country more than we have ever needed. So I explained to those students that I'm an optimist. I've always been an intrinsic optimist. I always will be. But I'm also maybe among the dwindling minority that believes that artificial intelligence, with all the challenges that it's bringing for humanity, with all the perils that it may have for us, we will overcome that. I believe in humanity. I believe that artificial intelligence will never have the emotions we do, would never have the feelings we do, would never have that sixth sense that we do, would never have the commitment to the future that we as a race of humanity do. And I believe that we would come all the challenges. We are a race, we are a species that knows how to deal with unknown and how to overcome challenges. And I'm sure that tonight is a conversation in that direction. Enjoy it, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Kazim, and thank you so much. We have an excellent panel of experts here this evening. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to them to introduce themselves and get this program started. And to kick it off, I hand it to BRENNAN-MARQUEZ.
Hi everybody, welcome. Especially those of you who are law school graduates, welcome to law school, our lovely building here. It's really, I think, going to be a delight to have this conversation, and we're really hoping to keep it especially conversational and then have plenty of time to hear from all of you, because obviously these topics are of the utmost importance and urgency. So I'll just briefly introduce the panelists. If you want to learn more about their quite significant accomplishments and accolades, you can do so in the programming materials that were sent around, but I'll keep it brief so we can maximize time for our conversation. Immediately to my right is REGINA GALLAGHER, who is the, I'm going to get your title right, is the Vice President of Engineering Platforms and Experience at JPMorgan Chase. Just to her right is Eric Barron, who is a 07 graduate of the law school, and the partner, and he's a partner at Cantor Colburn LLP, where he chairs the Artificial Intelligence Practice Group. And then to his right is Joe Johnson, who's on the faculty at the School of Engineering. He's an associate professor in residence and associate director of undergraduate programs in computing. So I thought that maybe the best way to kind of get us started would be to maybe have Joe sort of give a high-level overview for all of us in the room, which very much includes me, who don't kind of wade in these technical waters, of just understanding what are we talking about when we talk about machine learning and artificial intelligence. So, we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation tonight, but just to get a little bit of definitional sort of clarity up front.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me now? I can hear you now. Okay. All right, so let me just start out by talking in very general terms. Again, in the interest of time, it's going to be very general. I could get into a lot of definitions and so forth. I do not want to do that. Just keep this very brief because we want to engage in the conversation about the ethics part of this. But I'm just going to try to lay a little bit of groundwork about what AI is for those of us who are maybe less familiar with the topic and don't immerse ourselves in that milieu every day. So, generally speaking, in the field of AI, we like to think about AI in terms of intelligent behavior and how we define that. And we usually do so in the context of constructing intelligent agents. So we have this agent-based focus in artificial intelligence. That is the construction of intelligent agents. And what is an intelligent agent? It's essentially any entity, program, robot, otherwise, that can emulate some form of human behavior, but in a more disciplined sense, the idea is that the agent is capable of, say, being situated in some sort of initial state, taking in information from its surroundings by percepts, by basically taking in stimuli, in other words, processing that information, storing it as knowledge, using that knowledge to make inferences, further inferences about its own situation, so that it can make decisions in pursuit of some predefined goal. Okay, it's that pursuit of a goal, the ability to pursue a goal, which really defines the intelligent behavior of an agent. Okay, so like a calculator really isn't an intelligent agent because it's just doing the bidding of the person pushing the numbers, for example. However, a self-driving car is very much an autonomous agent because you're just going to dial in an address, and from where you're currently situated, it needs to map out a route It then needs to, in real time, take in information as it proceeds along that route. Again, it had to piece together that route on its own, based on some internally saved mapping software. But in real time, taking information from, say, surrounding vehicles, pedestrians, stop signs, stoplights, all sorts of stimuli, by which you can say, I can make inferences through image processing and knowledge representation, draw inferences about what it needs to do in real time, stepping on the brakes, stepping on the gas, avoiding other vehicles, and so on, okay, in pursuit of the ultimate goal of getting you safely to that destination that you mapped in at the outset. Okay, so that's what really defines intelligent behavior, at least in the context of AI. We all hear, like, intelligence being used colloquially, but in terms of AI, that's what we're thinking about. Okay, so having said that, there are a number of subdomains that we think about in terms of AI research. And I proceed sort of logically, hopefully down from, or start at just the processing of stimuli. So we talk about perception. So the first thing is perception, and that is, say, image processing, speech recognition, just being able to take that stimuli from the surrounding environment and being able to process and store that information in some meaningful way. So that's image processing, okay? Second thing is learning, right? So being able to take that information and extract patterns from that information, which will eventually be converted into rules that it can use to make intelligent decisions, again, in pursuit of goals. So we have perception, we have learning, we have knowledge representation, that's a thing, just being able to represent knowledge in an efficient way, so that it can be rapidly accessed and inferences drawn upon it in pursuit of those goals. Then we have the reasoning piece. Again, that's focused on making those inferences using the knowledge it has. And then finally, the planning piece, the actual construction of a sequence of steps, actions that can be daisy-chained together to take us from an initial state to an ultimate final state. Okay? And lastly, can't be ignored, but being able to process, understand natural language. It's almost its own thing. But again, sort of, to some degree, large degree, uniquely human endeavor and activity. Right? Natural language and the ability to understand that. Okay, so we have perception, we have learning, we have knowledge representation, we have reasoning, we have planning, and finally natural language. Okay, now, across all of those subdomains, there has come to the fore a very dominant form of machine software that is essentially called, as you well know probably, machine learning. And what machine learning actually sees itself pop up in not only the learning piece, but it also shows itself in perception and also in very large way in natural language processing. Okay? The other ones to some degree too, but those three are big ones. So machine learning definitely extends well beyond just the learning piece. Okay? And what is the thing that makes machine learning relevant here is that instead, in machine learning, that's essentially a branch of computer science in which, unique to it, instead of a software engineer coding rules explicitly to build software, the software is instead constructed as a result of the extraction of rules from the analysis of data. So data plays a central role in the building of the rules of the software. The software engineer does not explicitly code those rules. The software engineer is instead concerned with building a learning algorithm, a search algorithm, by which the agent can take a training set, a bunch of data, a bunch of examples, and mapping the inputs of those records to outputs. For example, a real simple example, one of the early examples is spam detection. Take a bunch of emails, label some as spam, label some as non-spam, through like 100,000 emails or something like that, it starts to figure out there are certain words that correspond to spam, some that don't, and it can therefore be given a new email and it can automatically have a model that's acquired through the training of the algorithm from all of those examples, and it can determine for new emails whether it's spam or not. More meaningfully, you can do things like, say, in medical care, where someone is given a CT scan or an MRI from which you can extract pixelated digital information and then be able to tell whether an image of a tumor is malignant or not, after having been presented with a few million images, some of which are malignant, or that of malignant tumors, others of which are not. It can make that kind of discrimination based on its extraction of a pattern from myriads of examples, large amounts of data. Why do we do this? The reason we do it is because with all of that data available to us, we can make software that is so much more accurate and so much more predictive than the rules that could be explicitly coded by any single software engineer or small group of software engineers. Okay? So no software engineer, no human could possibly be able to extract the rules from the millions of images or pieces of data that are presented to the software. Give that software a learning algorithm and a bunch of examples that can do things that a human couldn't possibly do. And we're seeing things, great things being done in medical care. For example, I'm just going to use the medical care thing as an example because it obviously has such great benefits. But being able to supersede the abilities of a human to detect whether or not somebody has cancer or not, for example, by looking at images. This is an example, but there's all kinds of other things. We are using machine learning, though, also in the processing of natural language. We're using it in finance. We're using it in manufacturing, and we're doing research like that at UConn. So this kind of thing has tremendous benefits. But again, the software engineer is not explicitly coding rules anymore. Instead, they're coding rules about a search algorithm that goes out and finds the rules. So it's one layer of indirection, if you will, right? And so there's a lot of good that can come from that. We're harnessing the power of the machine. There's also ethical issues, though, and that's what comes up here, because now we're looking at the data. The data has the rules sort of baked into it that we are going to glean out of it. And we don't really know what those rules are at the outset, right? So, that's where sort of the rubber meets the road in terms of ethical concerns. So a number of things about, first of all, what are those rules? Just one example of which is there bias built into the data, right? The nature of the data set could be biased at the outset. We don't know that going in, and then the rules pop out. And based on some of the example decisions that the machine makes, we find out about that. But that's just one of a number of things. At that point, I'm going to stop, sort of hand it back over. I hope that lays the groundwork.
Yeah, that's great. I think maybe it would make sense to have Regina jump in, and just because I know that she sort of lives in the world of user experience, which is often a sort of translational role, so to speak, right? Thinking about the technical questions and how, in the kind of rubber meets the road sense, how this actually sort of carries out to people's experience using these tools on the ground.
Thank you, Kyle. Yeah. When I hear the explanation that Joe just gave, and I'm thinking about those people I'm working with, I see the look on their face, and they're like, that's great, but what does this do for me? What's in it for me? And those in project management, they know that acronym is quick, right? So how do I figure out? Do I know what problem I'm trying to solve? Do I know what my goals are? Or do I even care to solve the challenge as well? I just want to know that if I use this new thing, this shiny new object, that's going to give me value every day, and I don't have to worry about those things. But, as Joe mentioned, the trigger on the software engineer and then the bias around the data. Software engineers want to code faster. All they want to do is code, usually when I end up talking to them. That's great, but you actually have to interact with the rest of the world sometimes. And there are companies, there was an article this morning, I can't remember the name of the company, where they did an exercise that reduced their delivery cycle from 9 weeks to a matter of days by using ChatGPT. That's awesome. But what is their data source? What is that input that they are using? If they're going after an open source situation, that could in turn create that inherent bias that Joe spoke of because they don't know what data they're selecting. My example is a website in Chicago that looks at crime rates around the city. And as a user, you can pick and choose which neighborhood. Mine supposedly is in the green, which is kind of nice, but I don't believe it because we don't know if that data is looking at just arrest records, arrest to conviction, and conviction were those that are overturned. So understanding that complexity is very key to say, okay, what is the problem we're truly trying to solve in using these types of tools and getting to that type of data? And that's kind of where my role comes in, is picking at their brain to figure out what that is so that they're not going blind and ending up in a situation where there may be legal implications and the like. So, anyway.
Yeah, I'm curious, Eric, if you have any reactions. I'm thinking, because we're the two lawyers up here, like the idea that we would just be sort of deploying tools that, they have great outcomes, and then at distributional level, we don't really know how they work. I mean, it's like a tort lawyer's nightmare, so.
Yeah, I definitely remember taking tort law here, and the idea was always go after anybody and everybody, look for the deep pockets. So I remember Professor McGill teaching at night, and after working during the day as I was a software engineer before I became an attorney. And to Joe's point about rules-based software generation, back then we were really focused on the aerospace industry. And some of the materials that I worked with were sensor-based systems where we're trying to figure out, can we detect faults as part of a gas turbine engine and what might be flowing through it. And we had to just be able to use our own intuition and look at with the sensor data that we had. We didn't have millions of samples, so we'd use our own intuition, make rules. But the nice thing about it was they were well-defined, repeatable. If it missed something, we could understand why. We could go back and look under the hood because we did the design. And one of the issues that we see with AI and the machine learning is they use these neural networks at the core oftentimes that have many layers that interrelate relationships that are not intuitive to humans. And it would be very hard to understand when it ran through the process of going through the data, how it came up with the different inferences. And you can't really always quantify it in words because it's looking at converting any kind of sensor data or image data into numbers and essentially these feature vectors to see how things might be interrelated. And so if there are problems, we just don't really know that we can see that. But I do like the easiness factor, certainly is nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's safe to say that in general, historically, the legal system's approach to liability writ large has been to ask what care was taken in respect to the particular case or the particular facts involved, and then for a party who's potentially facing liability to just say, hey, look, we used a tool that works really, really well in most cases, so don't bother us about this one. Just hasn't ever been a sufficient sort of answer to a charge for liability. The legal system may be evolving in a direction that's going to be more accommodating of that as these tools become more powerful, but that's really quite at odds with the historical kind of approach. So I'm sure we'll get into more of those issues as we proceed here. But I had a question based on a number of things and a kind of general theme that came up here around the question of bias and sort of bias in the data. I imagine that a lot of you in the audience, like me, have sort of seen lots of reports, maybe read some books. Recently it's kind of it's a hot topic, so to speak. I'm wondering if we could try to drill down a little bit on the definition of what we mean by bias in data, or kind of when we talk about the concerns about bias in data, what are we talking about? So Regina already raised the issue of just, it can be hard to take data that comes from a human source like the criminal justice system and convert it into a form that's really conveying the richness of itself, right? Like just the mere fact that there was a crime, well, what does that mean? Does it mean there was an arrest? Does it mean there was a conviction? What was the conviction really? We know people plead for things they didn't really do. There's all kinds of deep complexity to what that data point even is. So that might be one form of it. does that capture it? Is that exhaustive? Are there other versions of this sort of biased data problem? Because my sense is that this is sort of the next frontier for a lot of data governance issues, certainly at the kind of legislative level.
Of course, I'm going to take a stab at that one. Okay, so I'm going to start by just talking about a historical example. Maybe that will make it a little bit more concrete as to what I'm talking about with bias. And that's a case that came up, not a case, I'm not a lawyer, and what I'm leaving it. It was a situation at Amazon in which they were looking to streamline their hiring. So these big tech firms, they spend a lot of time sorting through resumes, interviewing candidates again, then having on-site, then having a second on-site. They're looking for the best and the brightest. They give them big offers when they find someone, but they spend a lot of time sifting through people to get to those gems they're looking for. So in an effort to sort of save themselves some time and money, they looked at making a machine learning model to pre-screen. This was done back in 2013, 14, 15. They abandoned the effort by 2017. So I'm more firm about the when they stopped doing it and when articles started getting written about it in 2018. But the idea was that they used a data set that was for the prior 10 years of their hire, both for the candidates who applied and weren't given an offer and for the candidates who were given an offer. So of course they had an annotated data set for what they deemed a success, an ideal candidate, and those of which they did not. Now first of all, the whole data set, both the ones and the zeros, the hires and non-hires, were mostly male anyway. But a tremendous disproportionate share of the ones that were hired were male. To the point where there were certain unnamed schools, women's colleges, for which none of the candidates were given a second interview after the pre-screen, right? Because the machine learning model determined that based on the annotated data set that they should be hiring males. So this came out, obviously, and in fact, so don't get, Amazon did not realize that this was, I don't know, I can't get in the heads of Amazon, but this of course, came to light, and then they said, well, we're not going to take gender out of it. Then the model learned, basically, some of these vocabulary that were used on resumes that tended to be more masculine, like execution or capture. And it tended to go from resumes that use those kinds of words, which generally were those of males. So it started learning things through other features to get back to the same place, right? So they eventually abandoned the whole thing, right? For this reason. And they knew it wasn't the right thing to do, and so they were like, my goodness, we don't want to pre-screen all these people out of it just based on prior experience. But I think it brings to light the idea that if your data set is already slanted a certain way, it has an impact on future decision making if you're relying on your AI model to make those decisions based on what was extracted from that data set.
I'd like to go a little old school on the data set. With user experience, a lot of what we do is we go out and we interview people. What do they want? What are they looking for? Most people think when they hear what product do I want, they think what's on the grocery shelf. My space is in internal software and how our engineers use tools to do their job every day. And what we're finding, and I've seen this in a number of scenarios in the engineering world, is that the business has a particular strategy for doing something a certain way. Adopting a cloud strategy, adopting an AI strategy even. And they only talk to the people that are going to confirm what they're saying. So from the get-go, they are closed off from any other data that might contradict what they are trying to do, and also might react quite vehemently when they are contradicted in public. And being so closed off ends up in a product that no one's ever going to use. User research statistics show that in software, about 45% of the capabilities developed are never used. And it's because of situations like that where they're going after that bias and not really going to the person who's doing the day job. I see people talking to senior managers, senior directors, people who set that strategy, not the people who are actually going to use the tool to do their day-to-day job. So again, a little more old school on the type of data we're gathering, but still the same concept of you're putting garbage in, you're going to get garbage out.
I think we've also seen in facial recognition modeling, there's been a number of cases earlier on where facial recognition was used and they claimed to have an accuracy that was fairly high. It was wrong 6% of the time. But when they looked down at the demographics, they found that for white males it was right 100% of the time, and people of color it was wrong 20% of the time. So a lot of it was just the training data that was used and how it learned certain features. We've also seen the IRS previously had a facial recognition module that they were trying to get taxpayers to take a picture of themselves and use that for authentication for biomarkers, but they stopped doing that last year because people were very skeptical about giving up their biometric data to the government and wondering how that might get used. So I think we also, along the lines of the data as well, see that sometimes the people who are making those decisions, as we know for engineering and computer science, it does tend to be fairly male-dominated. Some of the newer proposals that are coming out from various groups and government agencies are also focusing more on the trying to get women further involved in the process and developing AI systems and helping to select data sets and people of greater diversity. There's a strong push always, for the longest I recall, trying to increase the diversity across the workforce for any of these things. And I think the more people with different perspectives, we're more likely to also better identify, where are the biases and what I think versus what somebody else thinks is a good data set will differ, but that's how we're going to get a better overall quality.
Great. So I'm interested. One issue that preoccupies my own research. That's I'll take the opportunity to crowdsource my own scholarly work here. It's just what should we be sort of comparing the sort of technological or AI or machine learning mediated kind of version of, say, decision-making systems or intelligent or sort of soon-to-be intelligent systems. What should we be comparing it to? And what I mean by that is when you take examples like facial recognition for law enforcement purposes, or you take examples like hiring practices on the basis of a screening algorithm, well, we know that those are environments in which historically, at least the human counterpart has also been generally quite biased. Not every individual human necessarily, but if we asked about, say, how good are, if you take this sort of median police officer in terms of judging a situation, two identical situations, one involving a white suspect, one involving a black suspect, which one do we think a median police officer is going to be more prone to get wrong? Well, in lots of jurisdictions and lots of places, the answer is obviously the situation with the black suspect. Not every police officer, not every situation, not every subject, but on the whole, the same distributional kind of pattern you see, say, with facial recognition might be there too. And so one thing that you hear in this space for folks who I think are a little bit more on the tech enthusiast side, or even tech utopian side, is, well, look, okay, it's easy to kind of point out problems in the tech systems that we have currently and have historically, but the human version of these same things, the example of hiring would be likewise, if you have an environment where it's just an individual supervisor who's reading resumes at an intuitive level, what are they going to pick out? Maybe in 2023 they're going to be a little more concerned, rightly, about sort of gender diversity, but certainly historically the track record has been basically about as bad as Amazon's AI version. And so one thought is, well, if the human version has been so biased to begin with, and has been a site of historical inequality being reproduced, then, we should strive to make our AI systems always better, right? That's not a reason to be complacent, but it's also maybe a reason to be kind of, to try to get the AI systems to work better and not to be too disparaging of them, because the risk is that you get too disparaging of them, and then you shut down facial recognition, and what do you have? You have normal garden variety policing, which isn't so great either. In fact, arguably much worse in some ways. So I wonder how all of you sort of think about that question. I find in my world, in the kind of advocate and scholarly world on this, that it feels often like the two sides kind of talk past each other. One side is very concerned about things like bias, all the stuff we've been talking about up here, and rightly so. And the other side says, yeah, but the humans are so bad at this too. What do you want? And that is unfortunate, because that doesn't make for a productive conversation. They just then go back to their own little camps and have happy hour and talk about how the other side is missing the point entirely. So yeah, let's try to make some progress on that. That's one question. Floor's open. Or should we move to Q&A? No, I'm just kidding.
So I guess we'll start with a comment first that generally speaking, the way we think about, let's just put the bias data set aside for a moment, and that is generally the standard by which we measure an AI is, can it do better than a human? So we usually hold up the human standard as sort of the metric beyond which we wish to sort of take the AI. For example, driving, so in safety, right? We like to think that, well, if we have so many accidents per mile, per 1,000 miles for a human, can we do better than that for a self-driving car? So we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for it to be better than a human. When we're looking to say, for example, do cancer screening of images, right, for malignant tumors versus not, we don't want to hold back the AI and say, well, it's not perfect yet, so we're not going to do it. What we typically look at is it better than a human? And if it is, then we consider that a benefit to society. So that's, again, the metric. Then you get to something like a biased data set with hiring practices, and it's based on probably a data set that's influenced by the human participators that came before, right? And there's bias there, and it comes out in the software that we made. And at that point, we say that's not good. You know what? Is it better than a human, or is it maybe consistent with a human? Okay, but that's still not good. And suddenly, this metric that I was just talking about isn't so hot, right? And I don't know if anybody probably might have read about this in the news, but Sam Altman, who was the CEO of OpenAI, he did a testimony in front of some Senate panel, and he talked about licensing of AI firms, right? The government needs to play a role in regulating. It's for these kinds of things, I think, is what he was talking about, that there needs to be some form of oversight so that these kinds of social issues get confronted. Now, I understand, I know some people are wincing, they're like, oh, so government's the answer? I'm not saying it's the answer to everything, but I do think it's a concern to have these kinds of things, like, AI. So Amazon willingly, and I think that I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt, and when they saw this, they themselves, without public attention being brought to the case, decided to, of course, abandon that effort. But who's to say some smaller firm doesn't do something similar, and without that kind of, say, public blowback, because they're flying under the radar, are doing that sort of a thing. I think that there needs to be some form of address. I'm all ears to come up with, to think about other ways. But for example, okay, so I will say this, that lawyers have a governing agency in terms of like credentialing and so forth. You can't practice law unless, you're licensed by the professional organization. It's true of the, doctors, the AMA, and so forth. That's true of CPAs. They're talking about the report of the financial health of a firm. Why not, in something so incredibly important as this, as we're talking about it, in terms of AI, is there not any form of credentialing and licensing?
I think it's a matter of scale as well, that some of these AI models are more advanced than others, some are more well-known than others. And the bigger the models get, the more they can do, and then it might take the more potential reliance on them and maybe danger in relying on them. But we can definitely see, looking at the ChatGPT example, so ChatGPT uses the generative pre-trained transformer, that the model has evolved over time. There was an original version, 2, 3, 3.5, 4, is where they're at. And it takes a lot of processing capability to build this, but once they build it, they have seen very impressive results, enough to make people feel like they maybe could rely on it. They OpenAI publishes the results of taking these different GPT models and trying to go put them against standardized tests, AP exams, the LSAT. Turns out that GPT-4 had good enough LSAT that they could get into UConn Law, but they also had to pass the medical bar exam and a number of things. But looking across the spectrum, you can see as these models have improved over time and had larger data sets, they still fail a number of times. They're still not perfect. They do better than a number of the human test takers. So we can't say they're not going to be perfect. We can't necessarily just rely on it and say, oh, the machine's got it figured out. It's going to be wrong sometimes too, and in some areas it's wrong way more often. But I think there is at least the trajectory is improvement, but at the same time, as we get more reliant on that, I think we do need to look at what is the threshold for licensing or whatnot. We don't want the student in a college class trying to make a small AI module that does something limited and feel like they have to go against some registration board or something. But you're looking at what's the realm that this is going to operate in, what's the potential harm. Is this something that is an autonomous vehicle? Is it something that can make financial decisions? I know Zillow in the past thought they were clever and tried to use AI for figuring out when to buy homes and have their own business of trying to flip houses. And the AI model told them what to buy, and they ended up with half their inventory they couldn't sell for what they wanted, and they lost a ton of money. So you can try and you might succeed, but as the market changes, as factors change, your model was trained on some data at some point in time, and it might not really reflect reality, or may have locked in on the wrong parameters.
I think Eric and Joe brought up great points that it is a human building this at this point. So we're trying to build something better than ourselves. But we are also advancing. So there will always be that constant, I don't want to say churn, but the evolution will happen for both of us. I think and agree that whether we use governance and oversight terminology or whatever, that step at this point in its development is crucial. Otherwise, we end up in situations where, like I said earlier, we're going to be, somebody uses ChatGPT to create something off the internet based on that data source, which we know is perfect, right? The next thing you know, knowledge capital is stolen, lawsuits are pursued, and we're back to where we started.
Great. I think we're ready to maybe open it up for Q&A. I'll start. We'll move the audience just a moment here. I just want to make sure, do the panelists have any burning questions that they want to ask one another? Or should we just jump right to the audience? I asked you my burning question for my own research, so I want to quid pro quo.
I have too many, so
Okay.
I'm going to let the audience go for it.
Yeah, folks will be coming around with microphones, so just raise your hand. There will be people circulating.
I'm concerned, so in Connecticut, we're going to have municipal elections, and next year we're going to have presidential election. My concern is how far is this AI going to go and affect voter turnout next year?
I think that it's certainly something that is a valid concern. The AI itself isn't likely to impact. It's going to be some bad actors. I think one of the challenges is as this the generative AI gets better at writing stories, letters, things that sound real and are hard to distinguish from, did a person write this? Is this a real news story? You know, it's going to take some bad actors going to try to do this, and the public's going to have to be aware and that this is a risk, and I think more people are aware that you need to check your sources, but it's certainly something that it can be a problem with being able to figure out the difference between human-generated versus machine-generated. There was a different GPT program that was made called GPT-0 that's supposed to be able to identify whether text was more likely generated by AI or a human. And it's worked some of the times, but I think as the models keep advancing, it will be harder to distinguish. So there might be some tools that can be used, but people, I guess, need to be generally suspicious about any news they get. What's the real source of this?
That's a good point with regard to this odd situation that we're going to find ourselves in, where we have AI tools that say generate text and do certain amazing things, but then we need other forms of AI to detect when it's an AI actually taking action, like generating text or otherwise making decisions. This actually comes up, I'm not privy to anything, but I remember in the lab that I was in graduate school, we didn't work for the Department of Defense, and they were talking about these kinds of things, about attempts to infiltrate data sets by one party, and then the ability of that party to detect if they're being infiltrated. So, I'm sorry, why are they trying to attack the data sets? Oh, right, because the machine learning algorithm is so heavily based on it. So to infect someone's training set is to infect their software, right? And then, so what you need to do as countermeasures is to be constantly monitoring that data set and seeing if it's being corrupted in some way, using an AI, machine learning. Right. So it's a machine learning versus a machine learning. It's basically a bot against a bot v bot type show. And this will probably get used, as Eric's pointed out, in this idea of the upcoming election cycle.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that I think it's especially concerning because this dynamic that Joe's just talking about, because there's clear historical analogs in terms of espionage and intelligence and counterintelligence, but we've been able to rely in terms of global equilibria on a we understand in some intuitive way what the kind of limits are of the ability to train humans to do things like pollute the other side's informational systems, like spy work and so on, that both sides basically can train spies to the same maximal extent. The CIA and the Kremlin have the same capability, roughly. But it's not obvious that the kinds of jumps in capability that we're going to see will be predictable in the same way, or will have the same kind of logarithmic diminishing margin of return quality to them, that we could see jumps that we won't even really be aware of. So that's yet another thing to be terrified about if you were feeling too good about the state of the world.
So one of the questions I have, and I just wrote this as a post on LinkedIn not long ago, as I saw an interesting post from a VP over at Travelers with regard to AI, and had a whole bunch of questions. But the one thing that I thought was the most interesting thing is in my post was when the machine figures out that people waste resources and they were inefficient and that aren't necessary. So how do we stop that?
Field now, sort of a burgeoning sub-community, folks associated especially with the Effective Altruism Project, who are concerned about variants of this problem that often is described as the superintelligence problem or the kind of misalignment problem in AI. So what happens when you have the next generation and the generation after that of a system that has the characteristics that Joe was describing at the outset, namely that it is an agent that's able to pursue goals. Well, if it has goals that are different from the goals that it's been trained by us to try to pursue, then we might have some trouble on our hands, and there are folks who are trying to think about how to future-proof against those set of possibilities. I'm no expert in it, but it's on the radar of, I think, people who are at the forefront of thinking about these issues right now. And some would identify it as the main, the sort of overwhelming risk that we should really be, maybe only next to climate change, that we as a civilization should be worried about.
There was a recent New Yorker comic strip that had the bots with the whips and the humans with the heavy loads on their backs, and it all started with having it complete my sentence. But I mean, it certainly is something to consider, and a lot of the organizations that are writing potential policies or position papers, that's one of the things that they are concerned about as far as how far can this go and what will happen if the AI tries to get out of the box. The early training on GPT-4, before it got to the point of release, one of the things they were testing, they were trying to see what would happen under different scenarios when they gave prompts to ask it to do something to try to solve a problem, and they gave it messaging capability. And it sent a message. It came up trying to get into a system, and it had one of the reCAPTCHA where you have to be able to identify things on a screen, and you can't do that. But it sent a message through TaskRabbit to a human saying, "Can you tell me what's on the screen?" And the human typed back a message, "You're not a robot, right? Ha ha ha." And it went and it asked the question, it said, "No, I'm not a robot. I just have trouble with my vision." And it went on. So it is possible that if you had something that was really targeted, trying to do these jailbreaking scenarios and whatnot, that negative things could happen, and people might not realize that they are, serving the machine without realizing it. So that is, when they find these things, though, at least so far, up to this point in time, they've also been putting in a block. So they try to have these guardrails for the output to test for. Is somebody asking about how to build a bomb? Is somebody asking about how to incite a riot? But not everyone is going to play that way, so it is something to be concerned about.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ravi. I'm actually going back to what Kazan mentioned earlier, that he is more optimistic about this as compared to the robotics. We thought that they would take away all our jobs, but they didn't. I think this is a fundamentally different thing, at least this generative AI stuff that you guys have been talking about. I'll give you two examples. One is coding straight from requirements. In other words, you can describe what you can do, and ChatGPT seems to be able to code fairly well. They've been able to do a lot of very intricate coding just by descriptions. So what this will do is it will take jobs away from real coders and actually give it to systems engineers. So we could get rid of some of that. The second example I have is I heard a podcast from Economist where a person who was I guess she's a reporter. She said that what used to take her 20 hours or more to write can now be written in half an hour, because what she does is she actually gives it to ChatGPT. ChatGPT produces the entire report, and all she has to do is edit. When the editors know this, they're not going to pay the 20 hours worth of. So even though I understand that you are optimistic, maybe not that pessimistic, I think this is a fundamental change.
I would completely agree, and that's exactly the concerns I hear when I talk to software developers in my space. Excuse me. And that's where the human condition has to flip the coin on that argument. Not, I can cut headcount because they're faster and they're producing the status quo faster, but what else can they do for me? What else can I get out to my customers faster? How can I increase my speed to market? And same with the editor. How many articles can I get up on the web now because they are using these types of tools? So if we think about the improvements in the quality of the work that these people are doing because these tools are out there, rather than okay, I'm producing the same junky code, and therefore a capability that nobody wants to use faster. It's that piece of the human condition that, like I said, that we have to flip the coin on.
I have a follow-up to what you just said, and that's to do with the intellectual property of that code. I'm able to go through the software engineers. I just ran into this issue where the more savvy was actually were using ChatGPT to enhance the productivity by doing some conversion. The problem that my company has with it is that they're voluntarily handing over intellectual property in the process of doing that, including that training set. And the question is, do we not own that anymore? Is that something we can be doing? Because we're potentially, damaging our business by handing that over. Now, the argument against that is it's very small snippets of it. It's not the entire system. You can't reverse engineer all of that. But still, that's now out there. You've lost control of it. So, where is the ownership? Is that, I guess, more of a legal question than an ethical one?
A little bit of both, to be totally honest. From my opinion, from a corporate structure standpoint, we need the policies in place to ensure that we are not defrauding in use of knowledge capital that we don't own. And then in terms of the individual going out and choosing to do that, because that's the one I really want working with. That they are actually actively going out and taking, it may be snippets now, but as we go to the other gentleman's example of how do we prevent it from becoming better than us and taking over? We've got to take those kinds of things into consideration. And from my experience in prior companies, the ethical side of it all has outweighed the desire to have those snippets into the equation.
Right, and it's a bit more cut and dry if you're copy-pasting it into ChatGPT, but you have products from Microsoft like GitHub Copilot that essentially do the same thing, but they do it right in your IDE, right in your integrated development environment. So you're getting those same kind of hits, and it's still accomplishing it through the same mechanism. It may or may not be sending it back over the wire. It depends on your arrangement with Microsoft. So it becomes really gray to figure out what is and isn't okay here.
Well, you just said the key word. What is the arrangement with Microsoft? It goes back to that oversight. What do we agree to? What do we assign agreements to? And what is the penalty for violating that agreement? Looking at the data sets that I've been involved in and the development we're trying to do, even within the firm, we have rules and barriers around integrating certain aspects of data because of the variety of rules around the world on how and when and whose data we can keep and for how long. So you think about records retention and things like that as well. Those need to continue to evolve along with these capabilities to ensure that those types of things are not, in fact, as detrimental as they can be. Because you're right. That could take things to a whole nother level.
And along with the software, there's a class action suit against Microsoft and GitHub for doing that, grabbing people's code and just incorporating it and building bigger pieces of software, because generally people putting their code in there, it's going to be licensed open source and they're supposed to have attribution. So now they're not getting any recognition for all the effort, the hours they spent building that. Other people are just able to grab it, they don't really know where it came from. Now you might have some software incorporated into your larger product that doesn't have a proper license either, and eventually as things shake out, there might be some way to trace these things better. But the analogy is kind of to the days of Napster. People remember Napster when it first came out, that people were like, oh, this is great, we can get free music, and everybody kind of knew what was wrong, but oh man, these MP3s are awesome. But that industry didn't go away. There was a big lawsuit over that, and things developed, and we had YouTube and Spotify and all these other services that they ended up having agreements and larger scale licenses so that the creators of the content at least get some value back out of it. It's not just, here's a big pile of free information and we're going to go use this and privatize it and make our company profit off of all these people's work. But it's certainly risky to use those tools without understanding where it's coming from, and in the same the same line, if people are going back saying, fix my code to these tools, to the extent there was a trade secret, it may not be a trade secret anymore if you're sending your code back and it's not a license in between, or it's not a non-disclosure agreement, this is just the open version of it. Like on the ChatGPT example, they tell you up front that this is a research version and people are going to look at this. So to the extent that if it was a trade secret, it's not going to be a trade secret anymore.
Hi, Ron Catino. I work in the data organization for an insurance company, an old insurance company, and data is at the center of everything we do. Ethics is at the center of everything we do. As we think about this being a turning point with us, what would you say you look for as insurance leaders to manage AI that balances IP protection and doing the right thing? It's a loaded question.
I know in some insurance companies, for example, they try to limit the use of the AI tools to only certain groups, or have a private version where they can train and do some fine-tuning for their own internal use in the organization and make sure that it's firewalled off from the outside. There's certainly a risk if you put in customer information, personal information, that you're now exposing data that you didn't have a right to expose, and in some countries that's looked at a lot harsher than others. I think the insurance industry has an opportunity to try to create insurance essentially for some of the liability issues that come up related to the use of AI. So if somebody sells software that is AI software, and a lot of times in the licensing terms they're going to limit their liability to how much did this company spend when they sold the software, but the damage could be a lot greater if it's widely used. So the insurance industry certainly has an interest in understanding better what these risks are and how can they turn that into something that can be an insurance product, I would say, to try to limit the damages and fill in some of the liability risks. But it's great that ethics is at your center, and we hope that's true for every company. And the large companies tend to be better at focusing on that. Some of the smaller ones are just trying to do what they can to get ahead.
My background also includes a nice chunk of time with a very large health insurance company, and I will say in those days they were super paranoid, exactly to your point about how much of that data is shared, where is it shared. Even within the company, there were sections of the company where if you didn't have the clearance, you were not allowed to even walk into. And as things have started to evolve, moving data to the cloud and understanding that impact and how that helps get those satellite versions of the data off desktops and into a controlled environment that for certain aspects is privatized, like towards it, what Eric mentioned, and then getting the data normalized and increasing those practices to understand the impact that PHI, your name, your social security number, all that information has, and getting that away from the use of the data for risk management, for understanding what type of individual needs what type of policy. Same in the financial industry. What type of person needs what type of mortgage. So making sure that we are looking at it holistically rather than focusing on those individual aspects of the data.
I have a question about guardrails. I just saw recently that there was a deep fake showing a bombing at the Pentagon, which caused the stock market to drop, and then people looked and said, no, this was a fake, and the market rebounded. So going forward, should the government be responsible for holding AI creation accountable for deepfakes? Because I think we're going to see it in the presidential election. We've seen it in music, we've seen it in text, it's videos next. How are we going to create a gatekeeper to help us figure out what's real and what's fake? Because as this gets better, it's going to be more difficult for even sophisticated companies to figure that out.
So I'm of the thinking that there needs to be some form of oversight. And I, for lack of a better option, I don't know who else to look to besides government. Within the industry, I think that's too close to the players themselves who stand to benefit. So there needs to be some sort of rules imposed on everybody evenly. And, you know, I'm not the one originating this. Sam Altman made these comments very recently. I said this, I literally said this, I think, last week, if not earlier this week, that there should be licensing. And in fact, if you fail to meet the obligations of your license agreement, then you should be held to account. So it should be very transparent who has the license to act in this AI environment, who has the authority to do so, and their actions should be transparent to everybody. Now this industry is moving extremely fast. I know it's very difficult to even keep up with the forms of AI that are sort of advancing. We're seeing this, you know, I know that probably a lot of you are familiar with this sort of open letter. I think it's been signed by Elon Musk and a number of other people about this idea of stopping the progress of ChatGPT-5 or the release of it, and at least putting some sort of hiatus of 6 months or something like that while we sit here and talk and think about it. While we can have the cool heads before it's some sort of emergency or not to, you know, but for us to discuss this before we move forward. I don't know if 6 months will do the job, but at least maybe we can start to talk about it. Let's put it this way. So Jeffrey Hinton worked at Google, is one of the luminaries in the subject, the research of neural networks, which is one of the sub-research areas within which we've made some of the biggest progress. Whether ChatGPT, by the way, ChatGPT-3 is a big neural network. I think 3.5 has 175 billion parameters built into it. It's effectively, you don't have to really know any features as a human. You need to throw a ton of data at it, and you have a humongous model, literally hundreds of billions of parameters at play, and it will, at increasing levels of scale, draw out the patterns in that text to come upon the syntax, the grammar, the semantics, you know, the ability to be conversational, all of these things. ChatGPT-5 will be that much more advanced, more parameters, right? And the thinking is, you know, we're probably, so are we at the point of a sentient AI? No, but we're probably at a point where we need to start to think about how we're going to manage it as you're talking.
Bigger picture, I would say, to me, the deepfake problem, the problem of a world where we can no longer rely on what we have been familiar with through all of human history as sources of authentication, what's coming at us informationally, is impossible. We're not going to solve that problem. It would be like saying, when humans first developed the capacity to write, if somebody said, well, wait a second, if a few people can write, they can mislead others by writing language down. We should try to nip that in the bud. Let's have an oversight board to make it so that before people write, we try to write. You'd say, well, I mean, you could do that. I'm not saying we shouldn't do these things, but that, like, the trend is going to be toward more and more capability in a decentralized way to be able to deploy this new technology of information transmission and manipulation. And that the resulting equilibrium will be ones in which everybody has the capability and the corresponding kind of ferreting out what's now like Defense Department stuff will become more widespread, and you can do it on the next version of your phone and so on to try to make sense of that kind of informational environment. But we're not going to be able to staunch the flow or the production of deep fakes and their equivalent in all domains of informational life.
And with that as well, I think it's a good idea to try to have oversight to the extent it's feasible for the larger organizations. But some of these things are really coming in from overseas, right? So if it comes from Russia or China, all the regulations in the US aren't really necessarily going to stop anything. There might be a technical solution where they could somehow filter and figure out the path it came through. But the kind of a Twitterized world that we live in, where people are looking for some immediate snippet of information and ready to jump and act and retweet it and build momentum off something that might not be real, I think it's just a reminder for people that back to the old kind of journalistic ways where people would actually have to go and look at a source and say, is this real? Does it have anything to corroborate this? But at the pace information moves, it's also possible they can make 5 different fake videos from different angles and really throw it off. But I think just reacting too fast to any kind of news is problematic.
This is a very simplistic concept, but it's one that has rang true for me over the years from my mother. Just because we can doesn't mean we should, right? So when it comes down to the ethics, many software development companies, when they look at the tools they're using, they think about it in the sense of, what do I want to be on the bleeding edge? And I think that's where we have some advantage in stemming the flow of adopting things too quickly. So the last company I worked at, it was N-2. Whatever the latest release was, we're going to be too behind it because we don't want to rush testing it in our environments, with our systems, with our people, to make sure we're not going to violate any of our policies. We're in a very heavily regulated industry to begin with. We had not just state, but federal level regulations, as well as an independent insurance commissioners organization overseeing us. So we want to be very careful about that. To me, at least from a large corporation standard, I think that's one of our best bets to ensure that we're trying to do the right thing and not be part of that equation.
I think we may be out of time. Do we have time for one more? One last question.
Yeah, one more back there. One last. Should be relatively easy. Thank you for the discussion. I'd like to go back to an issue of ethics that you guys have brought up. Is that humans are rational agents. We actually make decisions, and we build reason. We explain our decisions by building arguments, and we use these arguments to convince our peers of the ethical nature of the decision we recommend. AI systems are great at automating things and doing things really fast for us, but they don't provide a single explanation. As Joe pointed out, models have millions, hundreds of millions, billions of parameters, but they can't explain anything they do. As we build these systems, where is the boundary of our responsibilities for actually enabling tools that make decisions on our behalf if you can't actually have them back up and justify their decisions with a sound set of ethics value behind it? There are problems like the trolley problem that basically discuss this thing and say who's responsible for the decision that an automated system makes in absence of justification. So what are your thoughts on this? How do we approach that?
Thank you, Laurent. That's an excellent question. It's interesting because I was in graduate school back when Watson, the IBM construct, the software that won Jeopardy. Does anyone remember that? 2010. I'm dating myself, I guess. Anyway, so Watson won Jeopardy, but of course it did not have to explain itself for any of the answers that it had come up with. And in fact, neural networks, by the way, were nowhere near where they are now in terms of their level of advancement. Thank you, Jeffrey Hinton, for all of your contributions. Okay. But it did not have to give an explanation. So what am I leading to? So then they tried to take Watson. I know this because David Ferrucci came out of the same advising group that I did, but beforehand, so he was close friends with my advisor. Anyway, they tried to apply that in medical care. And in medical care, it really, at least at that time, was not doing well because they could not explain any of the answers that were coming out of Watson. Right? So they weren't happy with that, at least in terms of medical care, because they're like, we need this to be explainable. We can't have you diagnose a disease and not give us reasoning by which you led from, say, the set of inputs to an intermediate conclusion, to another intermediate conclusion, to finally the diagnosis that you're providing. There's no, it's completely opaque. And so it wasn't going anywhere. Now, are we still, is that still the case? I don't know. I've lost touch with all of those guys. I don't really know if that's still the case or if the medical care industry has embraced and said, well, you know what, regardless of the fact that you can't explain it, the fact of the matter is the models are quite predictive. I think we're going to go ahead anyway. I don't know that, but I do know that it was at least a problem back then. And certainly an area of research is in making an AI explainable, right? That is in terms of being able to provide some level of guidance, some level of, say, transparency into this multi-billion parameter model that, yes, is completely black box. It's very troubling to those, of course, right? And so are there areas of research that can maybe delve into some way of helping us reason? You know, there used to be a form of AI that was a logic-based, formal logic. It was declarative. You had rules. You started out with axioms for your problem domain. If this, then that. And through a series of inference rules, you could essentially throw a set of initial conditions, you know, that describe this initial state, and then it would reason through to arrive at a conclusion. And the beauty of that was it could give you a chain of all the rules by which it arrived at its conclusion. The problem with that, however, is that it wasn't nearly as good because, again, you're relying on your software engineer to know all of the rules. And we have far surpassed with machine learning and the ability of the machine learning algorithms to extract those rules that we couldn't possibly know because we're not capable of disseminating millions of records of data. There's just power in machine learning that we don't have in this expert system, formal logic type of software. I know there's another area of AI that is trying to marry formal logic-based AI with machine learning to see if it can come up with, using machine learning, the rules, some box set of rules by which it can make deductions and inferences that are in a more transparent way. That's, you know, still, I don't hear anywhere near as much about progress there as I do more about things like ChatGPT, which again, black box, but my gosh, that black box is really quality. That's all I have.
Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Let's all give applause to everyone involved. Thank you for your excellent questions. This was quite lively.
Once again, if I could ask one more round of applause for a fantastic panel. Before we wrap up tonight, I just wanted to extend our thanks. My name is Joshua Pruitt. I'm the Senior Director of Alumni Relations for Regional Engagement for the UConn Foundation. And on behalf of my colleague, Jordan Abbott, our Senior Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Law, my colleague, Kim Blanchett, our Senior Director of Alumni Relations from CLAS, and you met Kate Krause earlier, our Senior Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Engineering. I want to extend our thanks to you all for joining us for this panel today. I also want to give a special shout out and thank you to our former Provost and former Dean of CLAS, Jeremy Teitelbaum, who's with us tonight. If I can give a round of applause, please. I'd also like to give a special thanks to Laurent Michel, our Director of our Cybersecurity Center, for joining us today. He's here as well. He's the last question you just heard. Seemed like it was a softball, I think, you threw them on that one. As well as John Shandy, our department head from electrical engineering. He's here as well. But we do have a university trustee here as well. So, Brian, if I could ask you to stand. Brian Pollard, really quickly. For those of you that are alumni here, Brian is our alumni representative on the Board of Trustees. And so you as alumni have voices in what is done at the institution. So I would encourage you with the final minutes that we do have tonight to seek out Brian, talk to him, find out what his thoughts are, what your thoughts are on how the institution kind of operates. He is up for re-election this year, so he is competing against a number of people. That is not a plug for him necessarily, but to obviously understand what your voice means, because there are other candidates. I love you, Brian, you know. So anyways, but that being said, huge thank you to our panelists, to Joe, to Eric, to Regina, and Kyle. By the way, Regina flew in from Chicago for this. I don't know if you all knew that.
Lastly, and most importantly, the food is still out. And we've got to-go containers. See, now you're all happy to hear me dragging this out as long as I did, because you can take home food for all your loved ones. On behalf of all of us, thank you again. We do have a couple of programs. If you saw some QR codes scattered about, there's a number of activities that are happening that we invite you all to join. Next week specifically, we have a panel on climate change, where we are bringing a number of our political science and geography professors together, talking about why technology alone can't solve the climate crisis. So we encourage you to join that. That is virtual, so that is next Wednesday at 12 noon. Please take a snapshot of the QR code, sign up there. You can find all of our events at foundation.uconn.edu/events. And as I know all of you are itching for the exits, everybody's making a run for the food. So thank you all. I'll end it there. Thank you again. Please drive home safe, and thanks for joining us.